Straight ahead on Law and Crime Daily. Surfside victims to receive payments for housing and funeral expenses. Nearly a dozen lawsuits now filed against the Condo Association as the search efforts move from rescue to recovery.
They've searched for void spaces and they've searched for victims.
And why the judge who sentenced Derek Chauvin is now being asked to rewrite his legal analysis. Minnesota's top prosecutor is saying children who saw George Floyd die were traumatized. Plus, a trial within a trial. The case against Robert Durst is heating up as the defendant's own past testimony from another murder trial is being used against him.
Really, my best friend goes way back then, was dead.
And the remains of a missing 13-year-old boy led to more clues. A forensic pathologist weighs in on how Dylan Redwine died as his father stands trial for murder.
That the manner of death was homicide.
Law and Crime Daily covering court cases from coast to coast. Welcome everyone to Law and Crime Daily. I'm Brian Buckmeyer along with Terry Austin. In Surfside, Florida, the search and rescue mission at the building collapse has turned into a recovery operation. But as bodies are continuing to be pulled from the rubble, survivors and loved ones are turning to the courts looking for answers.
We have truly exhausted every option available to us in the search and rescue mission.
A tribute to the lives lost in Surfside. First responders standing side by side, pledging to carry on their recovery efforts.
They've used sonar, cameras, dogs, heavy machinery. They ran into a building they were told could collapse, and they braved fire, smoke, torrential rain, and strong winds in the hopes of finding people alive.
7 million pounds of concrete and debris removed, now taken in as evidence.
With our partners in NIST and our homicide detectives, our engineers are on the scene. They're tagging relevant information, data, evidence, collating it and transporting it to a site for later analysis.
2 weeks after the collapse, the Miami-Dade state attorney says members of a grand jury have agreed to look into how to prevent another similar disaster.
Our homicide detectives, our crime scene investigators have been from day one working hand in hand with our fire rescue personnel and our medical examiner's office.
More families and survivors are filing claims against the Condo Association. 4 new wrongful death lawsuits have been filed this week against Champlain Towers, bringing the total to at least 11. At an emergency hearing on Wednesday in one of those cases, a judge filed an official order for payments to begin immediately.
We were able to bring in the receiver who is managing the condominium funds from this point on, and he was able to provide information to the survivors of what they can expect and how to move forward and what is going to be required of them, what they can expect to receive, and also how they can participate in the hearings that the judge is doing on their behalf.
Families who have lost loved ones and residents in need of temporary housing will each receive up to $10,000. $2,000 will be provided to cover funeral expenses.
The point is to get them back to help rebuild their lives.
Late last Sunday, a judge denied an emergency request by a resident at the towers that didn't initially collapse to allow her to enter her unit. The woman, saying she believed her emotional support animal was still inside, wanted to try to retrieve it and offered to surrender any liability if she was hurt in the process. Hours later, the remaining structure was demolished. Here with us today is Miami criminal defense attorney Gigi Gonzalez and Terry Austin. Gigi, you're in Miami. How was the community reacting to the collapse of this condo?
South Florida has been completely distraught following this tragedy. Everybody knows somebody or knows somebody who is victim to this tragedy, and the stories have been absolutely unbelievable. We've had firefighters who recovered the bodies of their family members inside of the rubble. They have been searching for, survivors or for victims for days on end in the face of a very serious hurricane tropical storm here in South Florida. It's been a really bad vibe here in Miami, and our hearts just go out to the victims. And it has been amazing to see our community rally together in the face of this tragedy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Gigi. Terry, with nearly a dozen lawsuits and more expected to come, how is the judge going to manage all of this litigation?
It's interesting, Brian. The proceedings are moving forward very quickly. Gigi just mentioned that everybody is pulling together, and that even includes the attorneys for the receivership and the condo board. They recognize the fact that they have to pull all of the assets together, and they're working together to take the $48 million that's available in insurance funds and separate it out into claims like burial claims or property claims or claims for wrongful death. And they do, at the end of the day, recognize that nothing will really compensate these individuals, but they have to do their best to make sure that they soften the pain. So everyone is working together, including the attorneys.
Thanks, Terry. Turning now to other top legal news making headlines, ex-attorney Michael Avenatti has learned how much time he'll spend behind bars for extorting Nike. The former attorney was sentenced to 30 months in prison for attempting to extort the athletic company out of $25 million. In the hearing, Judge Gardev said, quote, Mr. Avenatti became drunk on the power of his platform, or what he perceived his platform to be. Avenatti is scheduled to stand trial next week in California on charges of defrauding clients out of millions of dollars, including one who's a paraplegic. And next year, he's set to go to trial for allegedly swindling Stormy Daniels out of $300,000. A judge has ruled that some former clients of now disgraced attorney Tom Girardi can pursue their collections lawsuit against his estranged wife, Erica Jane. The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills star is accused of faking her divorce from her husband of 22 years amid accusations Girardi embezzled millions of dollars from a fund intended for Lion Air crash victims. According to court records, 3 of Girardi's former clients will be able to collect $11 million owed by him for previous litigations. Hours after the ruling, Jane posted a GIF of herself on Instagram with a caption, "The Ice Queen can take it." Interesting turn of events there for the Ice Queen. Still ahead of Law and Crime Daily, how Robert Durst's own words from his first trial are now being used against him. But first, how Dylan Redwine died. The medical examiner takes the stand as a 13-year-old's father is on trial for murder. The testimony you don't want to miss, next. Welcome back. A forensic pathologist testifies in the trial of Mark Redwine that he doesn't know how Dylan Redwine died, but he's certain it was a homicide. Law and Crime's Anjanette Levy is here with that testimony.
Yeah, Brian, Dr. Robert Kurtzman was involved in this case to give an opinion about how Dylan Redwine died.
Dr. Robert Kurtzman testified he examined Dylan Redwine's bones, including his skull, to try to figure out how the 13-year-old boy died.
I can't honestly say I would know the cause of death. All the organs are gone, the skin is gone, all the soft tissue is absent.
But Dr. Kurtzman said the circumstances surrounding Dylan Redwine's disappearance and death, including the fact that Dylan's blood was found under a rug in the home, led him to one conclusion:
That the manner of death was homicide.
Dylan Redwine disappeared on a court-ordered visit with his father, Mark, over Thanksgiving 2012. Part of Dylan's remains were found 7 months later, but his skull, found in 2015, would lead to clues about how Dylan died. There was a fracture in the skull. Dr. Kurtzman said fractures that happen when someone is alive will heal, but in this case...
So in the bones that I looked at with regard to Dylan Redwine, there had been no healing process.
Dr. Kurtzman testified the skull fracture happening around the time of death led him to conclude Dylan's death was a homicide, the cause undetermined. He showed jurors the fractures in Dylan's skull.
This can be associated with blunt force injury.
Now, under cross-examination, Dr. Kurtzman, like other experts in this case, said that there was evidence that animals had left markings on Dylan Redwine's skull, but he said, of course, that happened after Dylan died, not before or around the time that he died. He also said that there was evidence of cut marks on the skull, and he said that was likely made by a knife. Kurtzman added that bears do not carry knives. Brian?
Thanks, Anjanette. Let's bring back criminal defense attorney Gigi Gonzalez and Terry Austin. Terry, the forensic pathologist can't definitively say what the cause of death is, but says it's a homicide. How significant is that for the defense?
You know, it's very important that the forensic pathologist can at least establish the fact that the manner was murder or homicide, because the reason is here, he can tell from looking at that skull that the injury to the skull had not healed. And so he died as a result of that injury. And so the manners of death, as we all know, is either murder, suicide, accident, natural, or undetermined. And he's determined, because that skull injury had not healed, that the manner, in fact, was homicide. So that's very important. And as far as the defense is concerned, even if the exact cause isn't known, that is an important factor, and that is going to hurt the defense.
Gigi, my defense senses are tingling. You can't tell me cause of death, but you can determine the manner of death. Do you think that the defense can put on their own expert to try to create a little reasonable doubt there?
Yeah, absolutely. And they should, because if they are able to establish that these injuries to Dylan's skull were caused by anything other than homicide, then that will absolutely raise reasonable doubt. And the fact that the coroner here could not determine a cause of death, only base his assumptions on the circumstances of his death, would really help the defense here. So if they can get an expert to come on the stand and say that this boy did not die from blunt force trauma, but from something else, it would definitely be helpful to the defense.
Yeah, maybe it doesn't happen before he died. Maybe it happened close in time. We'll see how an expert may be able to describe that if the defense does that. And Jeanette, an investigator also testified about Mark Redwine and that 2013 search of where part of Dylan Redwine's remains were found. What exactly did he say?
Yeah, the investigator, his name was Tom Cowing, and he actually testified that as they were hoping to search Middle Mountain, as the snow was melting in June of 2013, it had melted. They wanted to get up there to search because they couldn't before then. He said that he tried to email and call Mark Redwine, and he received no response. Finally, he said that a day or two before the search started, Mark Redwine finally answered and said he hadn't been in touch or heard from, or, hadn't answered because he dropped his phone in his sink and the phone was damaged. He said that the other family members, including Dylan's mother and brother and stepfather, took part in that June of 2013 search where the partial remains were found. But Mark Redwine didn't. But he said when he notified him that some of the remains had been found, that Mark Redwine started to cry.
Interesting testimony. We'll see how it all comes together as this case develops, and we'll continue to follow it. Make sure to check the Law and Crime Network for gavel-to-gavel coverage of the Dylan Redwine murder trial, where his father, Mark Redwine, is on trial for his murder. Coming up on Law and Crime Daily, George Floyd's family attorney to represent a familiar face. Plus, the murder of George Floyd and the children who witnessed it. Why Minnesota's top prosecutors is now asking a judge to reconsider his legal analysis for how those minors impacted Derek Chauvin's sentence. Next. We're back. The family of a bystander killed during a Minneapolis police chase is now being represented by the same attorney who represents George Floyd's family. Civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump announced he has been retained by Lanil Fraser's family. Police say Fraser died Tuesday morning when an officer pursuing a carjacking suspect accused of multiple robberies collided with a vehicle at an intersection. Fraser was the uncle of Darnella Fraser, the young woman who filmed the video of George Floyd's murder seen around the world. Turning now to the George Floyd case, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison is asking the judge to modify Derek Chauvin's sentencing memorandum. Judge Peter Cahill sentenced Chauvin to 22.5 years in prison. Cahill departed from the state's guideline, but for one less aggravating factor than prosecutors had hoped. 4 children were present and testified at trial. Cahill ruled prosecutors presented no evidence the minors were traumatized by witnessing the murder, and therefore their presence at the scene is not a substantial and compelling reason for a higher sentence. Ellison disagrees and wants Cahill to change his legal analysis on the record. Ellison is not asking for Cahill to modify Chauvin's sentence. Back with us is criminal defense attorney Gigi Gonzalez and co-host Terry Austin. Terry, this motion, the psychiatrist's CV and the request seems straightforward and on point. Do you think Judge Cahill will agree with the prosecution?
Well, I read the motion and looked at the CV. It was quite impressive, but I think the judge will be sympathetic, but I don't think Judge Cahill is going to change his mind. He said that the prosecution did not present evidence showing that the minors were traumatized. Now, of course, they did testify, but there was no corroborating evidence saying that they were actually traumatized. So he didn't apply that as far as the higher sentence is concerned. So I think at the end of the day, he's going to read the papers. He'll be sympathetic, but he'll keep the decision because at this point, it really is moot. They're not asking to higher the sentence. So it's probably a moot point.
It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. Maybe the prosecution is laying the groundwork for future litigation to show that this is a factor that does apply. Gigi, it's not going to affect the sentence, as Terry says. So do you think Eric Nelson, the defense attorney for Derek Chauvin, will or should even reply to this motion?
You know, I don't think he should, but if he does reply, I think at most he's going to adopt his arguments that he made for sentencing. Again, this is not going to affect the sentence. It's not going to lower it or raise it in any way. It's not going to be modified, but it may affect Derek Chauvin's status in prison if he continues to assert that children were not traumatized by this event. So, you know, it might be to the defendant's benefit not to respond to it, but the attorney here has a duty to his client to zealously advocate for him. So we may see a response from Nelson in this case. Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see how Judge Cahill responds and also his understanding of it, because he did take a bit of a procedural standpoint. He didn't say that the children were not traumatized, merely that the prosecution didn't present the evidence. So maybe this presentation of the evidence changes that equation. Of course, we'll follow this and give you updates as that comes up. When we come back, the latest in California versus Robert Durst, how reenacting a previous trial can bring up some relevant evidence for this trial. Welcome back. Now to California, where the Robert Durst trial continues with transcripts from the Morris Black murder trial. The real estate heir is accused of murdering his best friend, Susan Berman, in December 2000. Robert Durst was previously accused of the murder and dismemberment of his neighbor, Morris Black. While he admitted to the dismemberment, he was acquitted of the murder by claiming self-defense. These are Durst's own words of when he allegedly found out that his best friend was murdered.
I should go to the LA Times on the internet that Susan Berman had been murdered over Christmas.
What did you think?
I felt terrible for Susan, and terrible that really my best friend goes way back then was dead.
Durst then goes on to describe how he learned that he was a possible suspect. He says that when he fled to Galveston, Texas.
His response was that he was getting calls from reporters that Susan Berman, Robert Durst's good friend, was murdered in San Francisco over Christmas, and Janine Pirro had spoken to the press, and I can't remember the word that he used, but is saying that you are not aiding and abetting or some other legal term for it.
So Janine Pirro, now you have just learned of the death of your good friend, the murder of your good friend, and shortly after that, Janine Pirro is claiming that you were involved?
Seemingly, Janine Pirro was claiming, yes.
It was in Galveston, Texas, where Robert Durst met his neighbor, Morris Black. The two got into a fight where Durst is said to have accidentally fired a gun and killed Morris Black.
I went to pull the gun, and the gun didn't move. He moved, and the two of us fell back like that.
As you hit the ground or the floor, and as your elbow hit, what happened?
The gun went off.
Bam, like that?
Like that.
The court also read the transcript from when Durst openly admitted to dismembering and dumping Black's body.
Several saws, an axe, and hammers, and other stuff like that. And I got this idea that the body rolled up in the drop cloth, that I was going to cut it in half.
Mr. Durst, did you, during the course of that day, dismember Mr. Morris Black's body?
Yes, sir.
What did you do with the parts of the body?
I put them in garbage bags.
Did you throw them all in the same place there?
Yes, sir.
All right, let's dissect this trial within a trial. Gigi, where is Lewin going with this? Durst was acquitted of murder. Could Lewin be suggesting that maybe the reason why we can't find Susan Berman is because Durst got better at dismembering this time around?
You know, possibly. I think it's a really interesting angle that he's taking here. But the reality is, you know, if Robert Durst admitted to dismembering the body here and the other bodies were not dismembered, then wouldn't that lead us to believe that Robert Durst, if he has a habit for dismembering people that he's killed, he would have dismembered the other people that he's allegedly killed? So, you know, I don't think the state's going to go that far if you really start to think about it with common sense terms.
Yeah, but this prosecution is so broad in its theories and its angles, it's going to be fascinating to see where ADA Lewin ends up in terms of what angle he wants to attack come summation. Terry, is there anything the defense can use here, or is this showing a pattern of death just surrounding Robert Durst?
Well, there's no question that death is surrounding Robert Durst. It definitely hurts the defense here. You know, Durst was acquitted of murdering Black, but he's admitted that he's dismembered him. And to me, that shows a depraved mind. It shows consciousness of guilt. And I think that's exactly what the jury is going to be thinking here. So we know that the wife's body was never found. We know that Black's body was, you know, dismembered. And we know that Susan Berman was shot and her body obviously was found. But I think at the end of the day, what the jury is going to be thinking about is, we know that Durst has a habit of covering things up. And we know that death is following him. So all of this damaging information is going to affect the verdict at the end of the day.
We'll see how that plays out. Law & Crime's got cameras in the court for you for Gavel to Gavel coverage. Thanks for joining us here on Law & Crime Daily. We'll see you next time as we discuss justice in America.